Ciao Torino. Hey. Sono Tim Messerschmidt e lavoro a PayPal. And I'm going to switch over to English because my Italian is crap. Sorry. As I already said, my name is Tim Messerschmidt, and I'm running the developer evangelism team for PayPal and Braintree in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific. And today I'm going to talk about a topic that I deeply care about, VDEV to passwords. So passwords are obviously a thing that we all have to live with, and in this talk I want to talk about the upsides and downsides of using them, of alternate technology, and where we are moving towards. Developer advocacy, is anyone familiar with this term? Developer relations, developer advocacy? Okay, a few of you. So our teams keep on traveling around the world, and we try to interact as a feedback channel for developers. We try to work with developers, talk about open technology, and we run a couple of hackathons worldwide. We're actually coming to Venice this year for an event that we call Battle Hack. So if you're living close by this area, you should definitely come by. Alberto over here is actually organizing the event. It's going to be kick-ass. It's in Venice, good food. All right. So VDEV to passwords. What is this all about, right? We are going to have a look at the key issues of them, because all of us realize passwords are vulnerable. And we all read about password issues over and over again. The media is constantly talking about this. And obviously there must be a way to cope with them, because quite often it is easy to say, well, because something is not easy, we just don't do it. But for developers, that's not always a choice, because our customers, our clients want to go for traditional authentication methods. And since this is usually a very boring topic, security, I try to make this a bit fun. So I hope you enjoyed it. Let's start off with a very simple question to the audience. Can you please raise your hand if you believe in security? Just raise your hand if you believe in security. Italy is actually kind of optimistic. I give this talk across all the different nations. I gave this talk in Russia. Nobody raised his hand in all. I gave this talk in the Netherlands. Everybody raised his hand. So it seems like from nation to nation, people have different beliefs. And that's actually something that we tend to see when we look at passwords as well. Different nations and different culture actually has different passwords. They use different influences like pop music and so on. And we're going to look into this. So I believe there's no such thing as 100% security. It is a concept that we all struggle to keep up with. But obviously on the same hand, in the same time, there's always a new exploit to be released. There's always a new thing coming up that we all don't know about yet. So we are going to have a look at this and how we can cope up with this, how we can keep up and what we can do. So let's start with a little education about passwords. Every time a big company is being hacked, hackers pride themselves in releasing those lists, and probably you've seen them somewhere already on Hacker News or so, where they say, these are the top 1,000 lists of Sony, or these are the top 1,000 lists of another company. That's the stupid passwords that people use. So let's have a look. Skull Security, which is an amazing security blog, compiled a list of the whole year 2012. So they took all the different leaks that appeared, and they looked at what is very common, what do people really use, and how does it affect user behavior. So did you know that nearly 5% of all users use the password? That's great, right? So I'm a software developer myself, and us as developers, we always tend to believe that people are thinking the same way that we are. So when we develop our apps, we think everybody knows how to navigate the app that's same way that we navigate the app. If we tend to come up with passwords, we think about really secure passwords with lots of characters and symbols and numbers and everything to make them really secure. Turns out the normal user, my mom or my grandma, they probably never thought about this. So we have to think about these guys, and that's something that is obviously a key issue for us. And since I'm a developer and I had this really high expectation that everybody starts to think like I do, I kind of reacted somehow like this. I was shocked. And normally, Germans are not really emotional, so you can believe if I look like this, I must be freaking out. So, obviously, hey, that's okay, that's the first password, it's very common, right? So, let's still believe that people are not that stupid. Turns out they are. 8.5% of all people 8.5% of all people use the password or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we add 2 more digits, we cover up to 10% of all users. Hey, that's fantastic, right? Because what's more secure than a 6-digit password? Obviously an 8-digit password. And the issue is, it doesn't even stop here. We can cover up to 10, like the top 10 with 14% of the passwords. That's crazy. 14% with just 10 passwords. Then we go up and use the top 100 and we cover 40% just by using 100 passwords. We're living in a world with affordable GPUs. Everybody can buy a gaming graphics card from NVIDIA or AMD or something like that. And those things are freaking fast, and you can use GPU power nowadays to brute force through passwords. So can you believe how long it's going to take me to brute force through 100 passwords? Probably a few seconds. Top 500 covers 79. And if we go up and we use the top 1,000 list, we cover up to 91% of all user accounts. So who of you guys uses an email address in a format like first name, last name @gmail.com or companyname.com? Just raise your hand. So I have all your usernames already. So how hard is it to guess your password if it's up in the 91%, right? So obviously that's where we have to start educating our users. That's where we have to help them to come up with more secure ways to authenticate. Good thing is, media is talking about this. All the different big journals, Wall Street Journal, financial magazines, blogs, even like the Gazzetta and something like that, talk about this. So we should expect that people learn, right? That we should expect that they adopt and change their passwords. So in 2013, CBS, which is a huge news station, released a list. It didn't really change at all. Good thing is, we see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is now more popular than password. Wow. And in 2013, a certain company got hacked with a very popular product that people love to pirate. And I don't want to do any name dropping over here, but you can actually see that password lists can be affected by trends. Products can affect password lists. And it's just crazy to see how one leak can actually affect this list so much that people actually have all their accounts affected by this. It's here. There's the link, scalsecurity.org/passwords. But it's also quite easy to Google those lists. So he's the guy that's going to brute force your accounts now. Don't tell him your name. All right. So the last list that I wanted to look at is actually affecting pop music and movie industry. So 2014, this looks pretty much like the other year. And we see passwords actually have trends. So what's happening over here is, for some reason, 5-digit passwords are now incredibly popular. People tend to think that monkeys are more awesome than 2013. We see Shadow is still in there, but also we have some really cool stuff. Like we have the Access, because Access is very creative when it comes to passwords. Michael, I don't know, was it Michael Jackson's anniversary or something? Like stuff like that. And an honorary mention. And now you guys are geeks, so you probably guess why this happens. And can you imagine why? Anyone, any guess? There's a movie coming out. So people actually pick their favorite movie, their favorite actor, their favorite band. You can just imagine the number of people that have Metallica as a password is crazily high. So if you go to the Metallica fan forum, the official one, you probably can get access to at least 10,000 or 20,000 accounts in milliseconds. It's hilarious, but people just do that because they don't really think about it. So we as developers have to start educating them. So if you talk about the problems over here, I think they are quite obvious, right? Passwords are being reused. People use those passwords over and over again, and they don't come up with new ones. Because obviously, if I think I have a secure password, I might use the same thing again. The amount of companies that force their users to change their password every month or every 3 months or so is very high. But instead of coming up with a new password, they take the month or they take the current favorite soccer player and they just add a 1 to it. Next time they add a 2 to it or something like that. People iterate over the same password. So people have really bad habits when it comes to reusing passwords. Then obviously at the same time people tend to be vulnerable to phishing. So all of us know those emails that tell us that we just won $5 million and that a Nigerian prince wants to give us lots of money. So please just share your details and share your passwords and he's going to send you lots of money, right? And then keyloggers. And we see keyloggers actually coming over to mobile nowadays. So that's why security companies like McAfee try to also be on mobile. And it's going to be interesting to see how a platform that used to be very secure, like Android, is now affected by these things. And then obviously Google tries to harden Android again. So we have this constant struggle, and that's where we developers have to obviously try to come up with smart things. Who here in this room watched Lord of the Rings, the first movie? A few of you? So I'm a hardcore geek. I had a very, very lonely youth because I was such a nerd. And I loved Lord of the Rings. I read it like 20 times. And there's this scene where Gandalf tries to go into Moria, which is the Dwarven realm. And behind them is a big monster, so they don't have much time. But Gandalf doesn't know the password. So he actually starts iterating over an Elvish dictionary. It's the first dictionary attack in history. So, and that's really what happens. That's what hackers do. They stand in front of a login. They use those password lists. They guess usernames because they are really easy to guess. And they get access. If you don't know Abstruse Goose, it's a fantastic site. I love it. It's really good. Who remembers this from last year? Okay, awesome. So April 7th, 2014 was a fantastic date if you've been working in security. Because suddenly OpenSSL became vulnerable. An exploit was discovered and all machines using a certain standard of OpenSSL got affected. So what happened is I could actually read the memory of those systems. So even if you encrypted passwords on runtime and decrypted them on runtime, people were actually able to read passwords. And I'm not sure how your day looked like, but for me, my Gmail inbox looked something like that. I got one email from Leapmotion telling me that they got affected by this. And then if this, then that, sent me an email. And then Wunderlist, which is an amazing service, sent me an email. And then Slack sent me an email. And so on, and so on, and so on. Because not just a few people that didn't care about security got affected. Pretty much the whole internet was affected by this. And now, can you imagine the amount of people that didn't reset their passwords after they pretty much got vulnerable? I would count them probably 10% of the people probably changed their passwords. Issue is you can't really get much user statistic on this because companies don't like to share stuff like that. Now, we can obviously make our services really hard to use and we can enforce really long passwords and we can make it really fun to enter passwords by adding CAPTCHA and stuff like that. But is that really great for user experience, especially on mobile? I wouldn't say so. So I've read up a few different articles on this topic on user experience. And Smashing Magazine, which is a fantastic resource for web developers and mobile developers, they actually also agree with me and say, if you favor the security of an app too much over the user experience, you make it a pain in the ass to use, right? So we have to do something else. We can't just force really long passwords and make sure they are unique. So first thing is, if we want to encourage people to use good passwords, we need to make it easy to actually enter them. There's a user researcher called Jacob Nielsen from Denmark who came up with different heuristics on user experience. And he says, why don't you allow your users to enter input and actually see what they've entered? So allow users to unmask passwords. Allow them to see their input. And that's something that's incredibly easy to do, right? Because this is just a Boolean that you set on the edit text, or this is just something similar on iOS. So why not allow that? That's actually an example from the Paper Lab. There is amazing open source for this stuff. Roberto Oggio, who's actually a speaker here at Droidcon as well, came up with this thing called Password View. So it does the unmasking of password. It has a strength indicator. So if you have ever any kind of regular basic authentication flow in your app, you should definitely have a look at this. It's really cool. It's really nice to use. Now, we have one big issue. People forget passwords, especially if they are unique, right? And that's why they tend to reuse them over and over again. So it's really hard to find numbers on this, again, because people don't like to publish them. But in this research from 2011, they surveyed about 700-something people from different scenes and different backgrounds. They actually had a user group of 45% admitting that if they forget a password, they just leave the service. They can't be bothered resetting a password or entering a security question. The simple reason is actually, on a lot of those mobile apps that ask us to register, we don't enter valuable information. How many of you have entered something like foo@bar as an email address before, or just entered anything in order to skip registration, right? Registration is sometimes really annoying, especially if I have to enter a lot of information that is stored somewhere else anyway. And that's why I think we all can kind of admit passwords suck. So what do, right? Sometimes we can't get rid of them, and that's where we have to secure them. So even if people get access to our password lists, and even if our users use very weak passwords, we can secure them. And that's where hashing comes in. Now, if we talk about hashing, people tend to think about SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-3, about MD5. And I got to say, that's not necessarily the best thing to do. But what happens realistically with hashing is we have a thing, the password, and a thing called the salt, which is a unique token that we generate for each password. So we pretty much randomize the password that is being stored. So we make it really, really hard to guess the hashed passwords afterwards, because the other party that tries to get access needs to get the salt out of this. So why is MD5 not necessarily a great hashing algorithm? Normally, as a developer, we strive for speed. We strive to make our apps really, really nice and easy to use and really fun and quick. Now, for hashing algorithms, that's actually a bad thing. Hashing algorithms, if they are fast, they are also really easy to brute force. The amount of time it takes me to brute force 1,000 passwords on a fast algorithm is really low. On a very expensive algorithm, like PBKDF2, is actually really expensive. And that's why we tend to pick very slow algorithms that actually make it really hard to do brute force attacks. So PBKDF2, which is really, really hard to say, stands for Password-Based Key Derivation Function, and is one of the standards that the IETF and RSA proclaim right now. Also really popular, and my tool of choice is bcrypt. And you find libraries for bcrypt, both server-side and client-side, for nearly every platform. And they are quite nice to use, so I definitely recommend having a look at these things if you have to deal with hashing. Now, I say def to password in my slides, right? So what does that mean? First way, we can actually get used to something that we call two-factor authentication. And two-factor authentication is something that companies like Google try to help you with. So Google has this thing called Google Authenticator, and every time the user logs in, he's being asked to add a token that is generated on runtime. It's a one-time token, so it should only be used on one machine. So if a user loses his phone, only one device is vulnerable, not the whole account. Stuff like that. So it's really nice. So two-factor authentication happens through applications, again, like Google Authenticator or Authy. They can happen through text messages or email. And they are really easy to generate. So first step, we can actually secure accounts by adding a second layer of security. So even if your users use those really weird passwords in the top 1,000 lists, we can still make sure that their accounts are not being hacked in seconds. And then there's this thing, which pretty much builds on the same assumption, that they call passwordless authentication. So why not skip the whole password flow, ask for a mobile number or ask for an email address, and just send a sign-in link or a token to sign in? Why not just go for a unique runtime-generated password for every login, or for the first login, and afterwards we just use cookies? Twitter and Yahoo actually go for this. Twitter announced a thing they call Fabric, and in there is a product called Digits, which goes directly to this area. So they say, well, it doesn't really make sense to use passwords anymore because they have all those issues that I've been talking about. So let's get rid of them. A good example of this is actually Startup Digest, which is a newsletter for startup events. And that's how the user login flow over there looks like. They ask for your email address. You enter your email address. After a few seconds, hopefully, you receive an email. And they ask you to click on a link or click on a button. Once you do that, you're logged in. Same thing with Slack. Slack is a fantastic chat tool that my team loves to use. And if you're on a desktop PC or on a laptop or something with a good keyboard, it is not a problem at all to enter a password or copy-paste a password, right? But as soon as you go to a mobile device, we face the issue of really tiny keyboards. So having a good secure password and entering that or copy-pasting that is a pain on mobile. So they say, just enter your email address and we can actually send you a sign-in link. So same thing that we've just seen before happens with Slack. So you click on that link, it opens up the app because they look for the intent or they use a custom URL scheme and you're logged in. That's a good user experience. That's something that I definitely advocate for. And now even in payments, you could do the same kind of idea. And the company I work with and worked for, Braintree, which is a part of PayPal, have a thing they call one-touch payments. So a lot of people have the PayPal app installed on their phone already. So for me, that's fantastic because that's how my salary is being generated. Thanks for using us. I hope you do. And the flow looks something like this. You have the app using the PayPal SDK. And obviously, if you're familiar with PayPal, what happens is we ask you to enter your login details, which is a username and an email, which is the email address and the password. Or nowadays, if you have the PayPal app installed, you click on PayPal. It opens up the PayPal app. It asks the user to agree and authorize the app. And after that, he just clicks on Confirm and Pay. So we leverage existing logins. And that's something that we all know from Facebook as well and Google+. We can leverage those existing logins that the user has on his device already. So he doesn't have to log in again. And I think this is a great concept because we shift security and we shift responsibility from the developer to other existing accounts. And especially if you have a small niche app which probably doesn't have the biggest user base already, users might still have existing other accounts that they might want to use. And that's where social sign-in also comes in. People hate to register, right? It is a pain to register. And I don't want to store all those account details, and especially if I have a long password and I use a unique email address with Gmail's plus scheme and stuff like that. I have to note these things down. Some people use 1Password or KeePass or LastPass to do that, but a lot of users still write down passwords. And they don't like to do that, especially if on mobile, because they don't want to open up their to-do list and enter a password over there and so on. So people tend to prefer social sign-in. They tend to prefer stuff that they've stored already instead of using new details, entering information again and again. And that's where the concept of identity comes in. So in identity, people nowadays kind of have different identities. If you're familiar with OpenID, they had the idea of saying, every user should have one central ID in the internet, and that's what we all use from now on, which was introduced in 2005. But we all tend to realize nowadays, on different networks, we tend to use different IDs. We present ourselves differently. If I use Facebook, I share how amazing my life is. I share that I have fantastic pizza in Italy and that there's sunshine. I wouldn't post, weather is crap over here, it's raining constantly, and the pizza was horrible, right? I always say how fantastic everything is. So it's not necessarily a 100% correct representation of myself. It's just the best one that I have. Then there is the concrete identity. So your bank doesn't have to know that you just had pizza and that there's sunshine because they don't care. They care about your real address or your bank account number and stuff like that. So that's what we like to call concrete identity, because it's real-life data which needs to match. And if we talk about e-commerce, where we come from as PayPal, obviously if you buy something in the internet on eBay or so, and you want that it actually gets shipped to you, you want to make sure that the address is right? So if you use identity in this area, you need to make sure that the data is actually valuable. And then there's this concept of thin or no identity. And that's where we come into just send me an anonymous login token, use my email address or my phone number. I click on a link and that's it. You don't need to know my name. You don't really need my email address. You don't want to do anything with my profile. You just want to skip login. And different technology serves different purpose over here. So lots of people tend to mess up authorization and authentication. Authorization really means I want to provide the details about myself. I want to prove it's me, Tim, standing in front of you. And authentication means I want to skip login. And if you look at stuff like OAuth 2 and OAuth 1, they often mix both of these things. They don't necessarily should do that, but they often do that because it's just convenient. I found this really cool quote by a science fiction author called Casey Cole. And she actually said, one person's data is another person's noise. So quite often if we use identity, and if you log in with Facebook or Twitter or something, you might get really good data because you want to know who is a friend of this guy or what music does he like. But sometimes people just enter fake information or they don't complete the profiles. So if you want to get my location via my Twitter profile, you get Berlin-Tegel, which is our airport. Doesn't help you, right? So if you want to ship a package to me, Berlin-Tegel is probably the worst place to send it to. So social versus concrete identity is something where we as developers have to pick the right identity. And I always think these things should be optional. So we shouldn't enforce identity. We should always allow the user to enter information afterwards, or we should allow identity to pretty much add extra information. It shouldn't be the first step in every app. Did anyone in this room ever touch OAuth 1? 2 people, 3 people. Did you like it? Me neither. It was a pain to use. So they came up with OAuth 1 in 2007, and this is the phase just before the first iPhone got introduced. So they didn't think about mobile phones with amazing touchscreens back then and stuff like that. There were no tweeting coffee machines. They didn't care about this stuff. So they came up with a really, really easy flow to get user details by providing 8 easy steps. So they came up with different token types, the request token, the authorization token, the access token, and so on. And you constantly had to refresh these things and go through this flow to make sure you still have access to user details. And that was obviously not very easy to do. And OAuth 1 had one key weakness. In 2009, people actually discovered that you could do replay attacks and man-in-the-middle attacks. And you could actually change URLs. Because OAuth is based on redirects to your service and the web service that you use, they could actually hijack logins. So that's where OAuth 1A comes from, if you've ever wondered. So they fixed it. 2012 came by, and they finally realized we need a new standard which is very scalable across different form factors. Embedded devices became a big thing. We have devices with keyboards, without keyboards, with any form of input or with any form of input, right? So we need to have a way to exchange these tokens anyway. So they reduced the login flow into 6 steps, and honestly, it's so much better to use. So if we look at how you pass this token, you normally use a header, and you just set the request property to authorization bearer and then the randomized token string. Or you can also pass that in the URL. Some people are just making photos. So if I want to pass a token, I can just do that through the URL. It's really easy to do. So you don't have to come up with timestamps and random generated nonces and all that stuff that you don't want to do anymore. So most of the data and most of the logic is in the backend. It's still not easy to implement on server side, but client side is actually really easy and fun to do. There are still lots of OAuth libraries, and if you go over to oauth.net/code, you will realize it's a big unordered list. So they say, these are all the libraries you know for Java. And that's fantastic. But sadly, it doesn't say this is compatible with Android, this is really good, this is bad, it follows the standard, it doesn't. So we have to kind of evaluate those things. If you ever had a deal with OAuth 1 or 1A on Java, and there are still companies enforcing you to do that, Signpost is pretty much the library to go to. And if you use Retrofit, which is a really cool library, there's also an add-on, a module to basically use Signpost and Retrofit together. If you ever have to deal with iOS, which probably you guys hopefully you don't have to do, also libraries around, they are pretty good. One comes from TweetDeck, so they better know what they do. Now, OpenID. I already talked about OpenID and the concept of a central identity. In 2005, that was a good idea. Back in 2009, they had more than 1 billion users, so people loved it. But if you go to myopenid.com, which is the biggest central identity that used to be around, it's gone. John Wayne, the company behind myopenid.com, stopped the service last year because they realized people like to pick different identity based on different use cases. So there are a bunch of different hybrid technologies which allow us to go for these authentication flows and get identities. OpenID OAuth extension is really old school, so I would never ever touch it. OpenID Connect, on the other hand, is actually pretty easy to do. They use the OAuth 2 stack, and they add a very thin layer on top of that. So it's a very clean approach to this. So if you ever have to implement anything with identity, you might want to look at this. I've talked about initial usage of apps already. And the thing that really annoys me is when I go to the Play Store and I download an app, and it asks me to log in, even before I see what it actually does. They often ask you, please log in with Facebook and Google Plus and all these different services or create an account. And I don't really know why, because they don't really share what they do with your data and they don't really tell you why you actually need to log in. And quite often that login is not even needed, right? So they just want some data. So I think login should always be something that enhances the experience. So make sure people can actually see what the app does before that you force them to log in. Make this optional and something nice and something pleasant on top. If you look at the upcoming technology, we already saw fingerprint being incredibly popular. Biometrics seems to be the big new thing in authentication. And biometry can replace passwords, right? But I have a big issue with this. If you look at passwords and all those password leaks and vulnerabilities that are being around, I only have 10 of these fingers here. So what is if somebody leaks my fingerprint? Do I have to chop off a finger and use the next one? So I think my fingerprint shouldn't be my password. It should be my identity. It should be my username. By providing you my fingerprint, I should say it's Tim standing in front of you, but it shouldn't necessarily give you anything on top of that. So username instead of password works for me. We can use a lot of those new devices that we all attach to our bodies and our environment to create something that I like to call a trusted environment. So I'm wearing a Moto 360 right now, which is a fantastic smartwatch. It's connected with Bluetooth Low Energy to my phone. A lot of people probably in this room have a fitness tracker for Fitbit or Withings or something else. Some people use Google Glass. So we have all these devices connected to our phone or to some other devices. And they create this mesh network that kind of prove that it's really you. Because why would I give my glasses to somebody else? Right? So can we leverage this to skip login? And Android actually does this nowadays with Android Lollipop, where they allow to add secure devices. So if I use my Nexus right now because it's connected to my watch, I don't have to enter my lock screen password anymore. I think this is fantastic. And we can obviously scale this concept by saying, well, if I am connected to my watch, and then if I use my home Wi-Fi, there's a good chance that I'm really at home, right? So nobody can watch over my shoulder. So should I still ask for passwords, or can I just remove this? But if I'm in a tube, I might obviously want this. If I'm in public transport, it's highly desirable. So if we talk about all this magical stuff where we don't do things anymore and we skip logins, we can talk about creepy technology. One thing that I love to talk about is Vinimi. And they actually measure heartbeat. They take a tiny EKG on your wristband. And there are certain patterns that even if you're running or if you're walking very slow, if you're doing hardcore sports or not, that never change. And by that, I can pretty much identify you, right? So if I'm wearing that wristband, there is a good chance it's really me, right? So as long as I don't take it off, you don't need to ask me for login anymore. In payments, Fujitsu actually has a device that does vein recognition. So by checking the blood flow, I can actually recognize people again, because also here, there are unique patterns. And there is one big advantage over fingerprints. If I chop off my arm, there's no more blood flow. So you can't use my password anymore. And then there's this device by a company called Emotive. And they actually track brainwaves through electricity. So you can use thoughts and images that you imagine as a password. So we tend to realize the classical concept of a password is something that we don't really use 5 or 10 years from now on anymore, because other devices are taking care of this. We come to this concept of scaling security and using different devices in combination to prove it's really you. If I go to Starbucks, do I really need to log in 3 times and enter 5 different passwords and 1-time tokens? Or is it okay to just say, well, since I wear my watch, I can obviously pay a coffee? But if I go to buy a new TV, I definitely desire that somebody asks me for a password at least once or twice, right? So depending on the use case, depending on the application, we can come up with different concepts of security. And that's something that the FIDO Alliance is working on, which is BlackBerry, which is Lenovo, Google, Microsoft, PayPal. All those industry companies kind of try to fix this. Because right now we have a lot of different standards, but they don't talk to each other. So you need to use weird extensions to make sure that you can transmit data from one service to another, but they don't really know about each other, right? So they try to come up with one standard that tries to fix this. So I slowly have to come to an end, and I got to say, security obviously needs an accessible standard. And I think FIDO Alliance is something that we all are going to see in the next few years. The Galaxy S5 fingerprint integration is actually using FIDO. We see more and more devices that support stuff like hardware keys to log in Gmail. So these devices are being on sale already, and they are getting really good adoption. We see this huge difference in authentication and authorization. So always think about, do you really need a user profile? Or do you just want to skip login? Do you just want the authentication bit? Pick your technology based on this, and not just because that's the standard. And allow people to use different profiles. And make it optional. If you want to get a user's Facebook details, tell him why. And not just because you can skip the login with it. And try to enhance the user experience. Don't make it worse by adding those barriers. Make it fun and pleasant to use, and make it something worthwhile for the user. Because users are becoming very aware about what they share and when they share it. So make sure they are always informed. Grazie.